In this video, I'm going to be showing you the fundamentals on how to use VRCLens in VRChat to record whatever you want semi-professionally. I'll be going over all the functions and tools that I use personally and what they do, but I will actually show you how I use them, unlike quite a few other tutorials that just kind of gloss over, oh, this is what it does. I'll actually show you how to use it, what combinations you could do, all that sort of stuff. I will be assuming that you already have VRCLens set up on your avatar. There are plenty of videos out there about VRCLens setup. I will not be covering that in this video. However, I will be covering the config in this video, which is something that you upload at an avatar level when you set it up. So I'm going to send you over to Unity so we could take a look at those config options, and I'll tell you which ones we should be using. So this is kind of what your scene is going to be looking like. You should have VRCLens just hanging out in the hierarchy. So if you take a look at your setup, you should have something looking like this. So there are a few settings that you can configure, like all of these default camera settings. You can have to anything you want. Those are actually configurable inside of VRChat. However, they will default every time you reset your avatar, so that's something to keep in mind. The things that you want to make sure are enabled specifically are here. Expression parameter usage settings. You want to enable drone controls, assuming you're going to use those, and you want to disable all of these dials. So the reason why they have the option for these dials is so you don't use as many parameters for the expression. If you have them enabled, they will use VRChat's rotation kind of dial, radial dial it's called, and you cannot smoothly like zoom in or focus with that. So you want all of these disabled. Otherwise, it will actually ruin a lot of the stuff that you could do with VRCLens. Outside of that, everything else is just up to your preference. The only other thing is sensor resolution. You do have to set this inside the actual avatar. So you can't change in VRChat what resolution you're actually recording at. And yep, that's about it. Let's get into the actual stuff. All right, so with all that settled, we should be ready to go. So first and foremost, I'm going to show you what my setup is right now as I'm talking to the VRCLens camera. So if you look at my perspective, I'm just talking to the camera that's sitting over there, and you can actually see that I'm looking at myself on my hand. I could actually look around, and it'll be from that perspective. You'll notice that I actually have a lot of red outline. That is because of the manual focus. I will be showing you how to do all of this setup later in the video, but we're just going to go over all the specific functions of VRCLens before then. So if you are interested in a very particular thing, you could look in the description or the little time scrubber, and it will show you, what I'm talking about at a specific time. So you can go through that. However, let's just get started with the stuff we can do. So to start, I'm going to disable everything that I got here. A very important thing to note is that once you switch avatars or reset the avatar, everything will turn off. As opposed to you disabling and enabling it, all the settings will stay the same. Like you can see the focus is still good, but the dropped camera will reset. Now, if you were to reset your avatar through like quick actions or switching back and forth, none of the settings will be the same. If we enable it again, it will have the default settings that the avatar uploaded with. However, it won't have anything that you already configured within the world, like my manual focus. So if you want to go into the VRCLens options, you'll be opening your expressions menu, and it should be on your main expressions unless you set it to a submenu. Once you go into it, you can see the entire menu. The menu is very convoluted. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of options. There are so many. I don't even remember where half of the things are, but it is important to note that a lot of the options, well, not a lot, but a good few of the options are in multiple pages. Like if you look at aperture and zoom, you go to settings, they're the same exact spot. However, if you go to advanced, you can see it's switched with drop, but zoom is still there. So again, really confusing. Now aperture's back and zoom's back, but like it's pretty confusing. But if you're looking for a very specific thing in your VRCLens, you'll find it eventually. It's really hard to remember the sub menu, but you know, it's just something you have to do. So we'll go over the options that you could see across the little screen here. Those are typically the things you want to start with so you can make sure that you're actually recording properly. So to get started, we're going to be looking at the DC down here. Again, DirectCast. That is typically what you want it on unless you're having issues with that. If you are having issues with that, you're going to want it on the stream camera mode. The stream camera mode, which is just no icon. So to change this, you're going to go into the main menu, you're going to go to Advanced, and then Movie Mode to the left. You'll notice a lot of the config options, I think almost every option here, is labeled yellow. That will indicate that is actually like configuring how the camera kind of works, as opposed to something that you can kind of do on the fly. So these should already be set before you do your filming. So if you click it, or I mean, I guess go to the left to kind of toggle it, then it'll toggle off, and you'll notice that my actual camera is now the same exact thing as my head display because it disabled itself. But if you wanted to use this mode, you can actually just bring out your stream camera, and you'll notice that the stream camera will be taken over by VRCLens. If I turn it behind me upside down, you'll notice that the stream camera is VRCLens. Typically, you don't want to do this, though, because this is a lot more performance heavy. So try DirectCast whenever possible. So I'm going to disable that, and I'm going to re-enable DirectCast. Another thing you'll be noticing that I'm doing is I'm actually touching the screen. You'll notice that when you set up your avatar, you had a little stick that you kind of put in your finger. You can see it right here on mine. I put on my left index finger. This will actually touch the screen and you can change where the focus is. So say if I were to walk up to this little bush here, the focus is on the bush right now. However, if I were to put it over to the right, it's now focusing on the background. That is one of the fundamental things you're going to be doing with VRCLens. So it's good to know. While we're on the topic of focus, I'll be covering what this top right icon means. It says AV. I don't actually know what it stands for, but I think it says it in the document. I'm not. I didn't look at it, though, very recently. But if you want to change that, that is the depth of field. That is basically your focus. So you can go back to the main menu. If you want to change that, you could go to Settings, Aperture, and then Depth of Field mode. You don't actually have to go to Settings. Again, like I said, a lot of these things are actually on the main menu. Aperture, you could just go to that, and then Depth of Field mode. So they're interconnected. I just kind of went a detour route, but that shows you something. By default, it should be on the little white AV icon. This is what you're going to want to use for basically everything. But you can set it to 2 different modes as well. So if you toggle it, you can see that it's now on depth. That basically makes it very, very highly focused. So you can see I'm very focused on the corner of this bush here, I guess. But everything else is very blurred out. The further you go, the less this is apparent. But it's something. I don't personally use it. I wouldn't actually change these settings, but I'm showing you just to show you. If you toggle it again, it'll turn off autofocus. So if you notice, if I focus on the bush, nothing to the right is blurred. Focus to the right, nothing to the left is blurred. So this is basically normal VRChat stream camera, just with extra features if you don't have the blur on. You're gonna want the depth of field on, so keep it at this setting for your own good. But no, it actually works a lot better. To go back to other settings that we have, the top left is your auto exposure. Right now, I have it default off because auto exposure can get really distracting at times. So to go to auto exposure, you can go to the main menu again and go to Settings, and then go to my bad, it's not actually over there. It's actually in advanced to the right, and then exposure to the top right. So you go there, and then you'll have another yellow icon that indicates something that you can toggle. So I just enabled it, and you see that it actually got a lot brighter. This is because that's auto exposure enabled. If it's white and black, it will automatically change its exposure based on what your camera is pointing at. So if the scene is very bright, it will darken it. If the scene's really dark, it will brighten it. So, for example, if we were to go to this tree over here and I actually enable the shadows in this world, you'll notice once we go in here, it's pretty bright. It's not that bad. But if we turn back, not much of a difference. But you'll notice if I turn back really quickly here, you can see it got noticeably brighter. So the auto exposure was kicking in because this is a very dark area. Well, not very dark, but it's a slightly dark area of the map. So it will slowly kind of fade in with the auto exposure, which makes it have a more realistic camera feel, but I wouldn't use it personally because it does get distracting at times. Because it is VRChat, a game, it kind of is unnecessary, I've seen. Whenever I have it enabled, it's usually very glaringly obvious whenever I switch between them, or whenever I switch between a dark and bright scene, it's like very noticeable, not in a good way. So I would have that disabled for the most part, but there is another third option. Again, there's a yellow option. That will actually lock whatever exposure it is at the moment. So we're at the exposure under the tree. If we now turn back, is now extremely bright everywhere else. And then if we disable it, it's back to VRChat normal, and that is typically what I'd keep it at. So that is your auto exposure. Let's take a look at a few of the other options here. So the top right, you'll notice a very empty area here, assuming you have the same config. That's right below autofocus and between stabilization. That is where the picture style will be. Again, you're probably going to want this disabled, but I'm going to show you it so you know what to look out for. So if you go back to the main menu, you go to settings and go to picture style to the top right, you're going to get a bunch of picture styles, 4 to be exact. Once you set one, it will show up to the top right. Typically, you don't want these on because there's no point to ingraining a film style in the actual recording itself rather than just doing in post-editing. Because if you didn't want the film style anymore, it's really hard to get rid of at that point. So I would have this disabled at all times. Just make sure that is empty in the top right corner, and you should be all right. If you want it enabled, though, of course, you can just have it enabled. I think it defaults to Filmic 2 or 1 or something. But, again, I wouldn't use that. Talking now about stabilization, you can see on the bottom of that, it's actually on the settings menu. So if you go from the main menu to settings, you have the stabilize option. Again, yellow to indicate that it's on this screen, kind of. The current stabilization option I'm on is the white option, which is basically just normal stabilization. If you move the camera around like very rapidly, it's not going to be all too bad. Even though it looks god awful in my point of view. But there are a few other options for it. Again, there's an off option and a yellow option. If you set it to yellow, you'll notice now, if you rotate the camera side to side, it won't actually rotate anymore. So this locks it to the horizon. This could be very useful. I use this actually pretty often. You wouldn't necessarily want it on by default, but it could be very useful for certain situations. So, again, this makes it so if you turn it to the left, if your hand rotates, just because that's what's going to happen when you're just holding a camera, it will be level with the ground. Again, if I disable it, that's how it actually looks. And this is without stabilization. You definitely want stabilization on, especially if you're doing any movement. If you're not using stabilization while you're moving, it's going to look really awful because VR is, in and of itself, really jittery. So always have stabilization. So the option right below stabilization is the avatar autofocus. This is something that I do not personally use at all, but it could be pretty useful. So if you go to focus and you see the autofocus right here, you could set it to white, yellow, and off. If I were to drop the camera here, to do that, you would just do something like advanced drop. And now the camera is dropped in the world. You can move around. You're completely fine. But if I were to go back to focus and set autofocus, right now, let's see me out of focus. So I'm on the side of this. I'm non-focused because the little indicator's focus point is to the right. But if I enable autofocus, still not on. But if I enable yellow, it will focus directly to your face at all times. That is pretty useful because if you're moving all the way back here, focus is going to be kept with you. This is only useful, however, if you are actually... I'm not actually talking. This is only useful, however, if you are actually a subject of the camera. Typically, you don't want to be a subject of the camera, especially if you have to have the camera moving around because, you know, the shots just don't look that great. But it could be very useful if you do have to move around and you want to be already in focus. That is what that white bar, when you set up the avatar, is about. That is actually your autofocus line. But moving on from that, that is actually basically all the icons that you could see around this. So if I call back the camera by just tapping enable again, we'll have the camera back in our hand. So the last three little things on the screen are the aperture, the exposure, again, and the zoom. So before we get into aperture, let's look at the exposure again. So if we go, again, back to advanced exposure, we can actually manually set it with the left and right. You'll notice the little indicator right here moves as we turn it up and down. That, for your record, does not change if auto exposure is on. So if it's super bright and we go into this dark area, this will not be moving, even though the exposure is changing. You can actually have an additive effect on the exposure by doing that. So this is only additive to the auto exposure. Let me disable that yet again and go back to our normal VRChat. And yeah, that's it for that. But the nice things that we're going to be looking at: aperture, zoom, and we're going to eventually look at focus. So let's take a look at zoom, because zoom is very, very fun to play with. So zoom is in basically all of the menus that you could see here. Settings, it's like in advanced too. It's kind of like aperture, but it's more places because it's very useful. So if you go into the zoom menu, you'll notice that it's a bunch of buttons. This might be a radial dial if you have the config set to that. You don't want it set to that because you can't zoom in smoothly if that's enabled, because you're going to actually have a dial that is, I don't know if you've seen it, I'll probably put it on screen, but the radial dial is kind of manually controlled by your thumbstick, which is not a smooth input ever. But these buttons on the little menu are a smooth input. So if we take a look at the camera, you'll notice the left side and right side, zoom out and zoom in. The left is basically all zoom out, except at different speeds. So the minus is quicker. The T is the quickest to zoom in. You can see how far it went that quickly. Again, W, quickest to zoom out, if you really have to just set it down there. And then down from there, it just gets slower and slower until it's quite slow. Same with zoom in. So it's pretty basic, but it is very, very useful. Again, this is smooth. So let's get a little example. So for example, this car, if we want to follow it, we might want to do this zoom, kind of slowly zoom out here, and then do a zoom in here, and kind of follow this car as it's going. Now we might want to go back to slower zoom in, just so we don't zoom in that quickly, though it does zoom in quite a bit quicker the farther you are. So if you're zoomed in very far, and then you click this, it's going to look like we're just zooming out really quickly, but once you actually get back to like where you are, it's not that quick. You can see it actually goes a lot slower the further back you are. But going out of zoom, we have aperture right here. So if we go to aperture, you can increase and decrease it. So increasing it will increase this number, and then you can lower it all the way to 0.3. So what in the world does aperture do? You might be asking. If you're a photo expert, you probably already know what it does, but I didn't know what it does because, hey, I don't take photos really. So I'm going to show you. So going back to our little bush here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so we're back to our normal 24 millimeter, because that's usually a good middle point. If we go into focus, we're going to have a bunch of options here. Typically it's on autofocus. However, if you set it to manual focus, which it actually doesn't defaultly go to until you tap it, then you'll see a red little outline for you. This is indicating the focus range. So everything in focus is in the red right now. So you could see that the tree and everything's in focus, but the bush, however, is not really in focus. It might not show up on camera because the bush in of itself is pretty low poly, but, you know, textures aren't that great. However, if we go out and go back to aperture, we could decrease this. And what decreasing it will do is decrease the range of the focus. So you can see it's much lower of a focus range. You keep decreasing it, it's just going to become the tinier and tinier sliver, all the way down 0.7 in this case. So this is only focusing on basically the tree at this point. Everything else is out of focus. This is very useful for quite a few things, but obviously you want to have like your subject in focus and everything. So for example, let's try to get this bush in focus right now. So to do that, I would have to go to my focus, manual focus, and I want to pull it pretty close to me. I want to have it basically, we'll try focusing like on the corner of the bush. So right now I have it set to the corner of the bush. Obviously, aperture is really low right now, so it's not going to focus on like anything at all. However, if we bump it back up, you can see on our screen, it's increasing, and on the actual view, the focus is getting better. So you basically want to calibrate this to make sure that your subject will always be in this focus. If you really want to have your subject in focus, you're going to want to change the aperture so you can actually have everything and you don't have to change the manual focus. So you can increase it and be like, okay, I want everything basically in front of me, but nothing outside of me. And it'll focus on everything except the stuff out there. You'll notice that the little icon here no longer does anything. It doesn't have any other function other than for the autofocus. If you want to re-enable autofocus, you could just go back to focus, tap autofocus, and you're back to the original. I'm going to turn back down the aperture because basically everything will be in focus now for the most part, so that's not really that good. We're going to turn that down. 1.3, 1.9. I think 1.9 is usually a pretty good number for it. It will be different depending on what your zoom and everything is, I believe. But so those are the main camera functions for VRCLens. At least all the ones that I use. Now I'm going to be going over the drone controls because this is like the bread and butter of VRCLens. You need to have it enabled if you're going to do like cinematic recordings or anything. It's really good. So I'm gonna go over how it works. So if you go into drone, you're gonna have the drop thing, and you're gonna see a lot of options here. The only ones you're gonna have to pay attention to, assuming you're in VR, are move camera, drop, hand rotate. That's kind of it. You can track yourself, but I've never used that. There's no, like, again, I wouldn't have the camera moving or floating in a drone if it has to focus on me. Like, I wouldn't have myself in the actual thing if it's moving. But you can have it. I'm not going to go over that. But effectively, if we drop it, again, it will be anchored in the world. So you can walk away from it. You could go right in front of it. You could say hi to it. I have autofocus on, so it'll be focusing on me depending on where my focus is. So the first option, which is very useful, which you should use, is hand rotate. Hand rotate will, as you can see, rotate it with the hand that you are currently using. So, on my right hand, I am now rotating the camera up and down. And it is also stabilized because I have stabilization on. So you can see it's slower than my actual hand rotation. That makes it very nice for the actual movement. Now, to actually get this camera moving, you can have hand rotate enabled and also have move camera enabled. So now, this will go forward, backwards, left, right. And now you could basically pilot this like a RC plane. So you can see I'm now pointing my hand at myself. It's kind of awkward, but I could point it down and I could go all the way back down. I could point it at myself. I could say, hi, hello. And yeah, I could bring it all the way to me. Typically, you don't want to have it pointing at you. Again, you'll probably not be on camera, and it also hurts your wrist, so you probably don't want to do that. But this is what you want to practice. You could get very cinematic shots with this drone camera. It is the best thing in VRCLens. But there is a thing to note with it. So this drone, only you can see it. So if you've been wondering why I have this fine fella just standing here this entire time, that's actually just my alternate account recording on my old PC. If I were to fly this camera wherever it is, I need to find it first. It's right there. Sometimes you could get it lost. If you do get it lost, you can drop it again. To do that, though, you kind of have to, like, disable it by just clicking on that, and then you could drop it again. So it'll be right where you are. You gotta enable and rotate and move camera, but I could get in right in the face of this guy and focus right into his soul. But on his end, he doesn't actually see the camera. It's just me. So whenever the camera is in drone mode, it is not visible. Same with like the actual camera screen. However, if I were to bring this camera back to my hand, now you could see that I'm actually holding a camera. If you don't want people to know that you're holding a camera for whatever reason, you can also disable that in settings. If you go to Advanced, Extra, and Hide Lens, it'll actually hide the lens model, and it won't be on anyone's screen. And also just to demonstrate that you can actually, other people can't see the screen that you're looking at. The alternate account is looking at me. I have the screen, but if it looks at the screen, it'll just see the model itself. So that's not a feature, just so you know, you're not, showing the screen to someone being like, oh, this is what it looks like. No, they won't actually be able to see it. But we go back down. That is the drone camera. You could do some cool stuff with it. I'm going to continue with the drone camera because there are a few other things to know about it. So if we drop it again, enable hand rotate. Anytime you disable it, these drone settings will disable. So if you go to drone speed, you can turn it all the way up. You could crank that thing, and now move camera. We'll go lightning speed. Now we are going like city level speed here. So we could very quickly kind of get an overview of this entire city. Because I'm not looking in this direction, it's actually kind of unloaded. It depends on where you are in the world. If there's optimizations, obviously, if your camera's too far from you, it's probably not going to look that great. But this is the fastest option. You can zoom all the way right back to spawn. You can actually phase through everything, by the way. I don't know if you do that, but you could actually go into anything and look past it if you really wanted to. You could do that with stream camera, though, too. Except it doesn't go this quickly. But, yeah, you could zoom right back here, and then you can lower the drone speed once again. Again, this is actually a rotary menu, so it's not that smooth. If you did want, like, smooth movement, you're better off just doing the thumbstick slower. So if you have it slightly up, you'll be going, you know, somewhat speed, and then all the way up, you'll be going the quickest speed. You don't want to be, like, messing with the actual speed while moving it. When I had it running before, 0% was, you know, normal speed, but now it's very slow speed. You can see the back of my head. I'm just zooming in really slowly. But yeah, 33 seems like the default camera speed. That is something to very much keep in mind. So if you do ever mess with the drone speed, 0% is slower once you actually like mess with the value. I didn't actually know that. I only just figured that out now, so that's good to know. But yeah, you can go slower. That's nice. There are more tracking options. I don't use these because they're very niche. They're there, but it's not that necessary. There is smoothing, which I've actually never messed with, but yeah, there's plenty of options to also mess with, but I've never had to use them. The only other thing that I want to go over is how to go up and down. So you'll notice in this camera, you can only go like left and right. So if I was trying to get a scene like right here, it's like, okay, I want to go up and like go into the sky, right? I can only go left, right, and up, forward, and back. However, there is actually a toggle for that, but it's not in the menu itself. If you toggle gestures, you make sure your gestures are on, and you do a finger gun. Then, if you go forward, it will start going up and down. So finger gun gesture will enable up and down as opposed to forward and back. Left and right will still be the same, but if I were to stop doing this, now it's again forward. If I were to start doing it while going forward, it's going to immediately switch. So that's something to keep in mind. That kind of tripped me up when I was using VRCLens, because I'd have gestures enabled, and I'd just be doing, I don't know, hand gestures just naturally on the side of my hand. Usually when I'm like trying to click on the screen, and then just suddenly start going up. So you're going to want to disable gestures if you don't want to have that happening. Or, of course, you could make use of it. Just make sure none of your hands are actually finger gunning unless you need them to, because your right hand can actually do the same thing too. Except if it is moving the camera, your thumb will be down, so it will actually just be a point instead of a finger gun. But that is the drone. And yeah, that's really about it. I mean, there isn't really too much more to VRCLens, so I'm just going to show you a few techniques that I use for VRCLens so you could get an idea of how I do some of my recordings. So, a lot of my recordings are actually with the drone mode. So, let's try, for example, to follow this bus here. So, I'm going to drop it. I'm going to enable hand rotate and move camera. I'm going to fly over to this bus. Now, say I just kind of want to follow the side of this bus right here. So, once it departs, I'll be holding back and right. So that'll be holding the camera back and right. I'll be zooming kind of with the camera, and I could kind of get in front of it. And of course, the thumbstick, the farther it is, the slower it'll go, or the faster it'll go. So you can go pretty good with things. Again, I accidentally did the up and down because my finger gun is here. You can go up and down with finger gun. Don't mistake that. I'm going to disable my gestures so I don't have the finger gun enabled, so I could just follow, say, like a car, and they're a bit too quick for the camera speed right now, but you kind of get the idea of what you're able to do. You can kind of focus on something if you rotate your body physically. So with the hand rotate, you would have to like weirdly rotate if you're not rotating your body. So typically you're going to still act as a cameraman. So say I want to focus on this sign right here. So to focus on this sign, I would kind of get into position by like, moving the camera up and down. And then as I'm pointing at it, going to the left, I'm going to turn my own body around to get a smooth turn. So I'm only like moving left and right. However, because I'm also rotating the camera while I'm turning, I'm actually kind of going around it. As opposed to, just left and right. I'm now going around. And it's really easy to kind of feel it out. So these are just things that you could practice. It's really good if you can actually master these things because they look so nice on camera. So that is kind of the drone camera. There isn't too much more to it. It's just a lot of movement and pacing, like what sort of movement you're trying to do. Especially if it's a script and your camera has to go a specific way. You just have to master replicating that way because you can't really do it like outside of that. So like going under here, if I wanted to reset because something went wrong, I'd have to manually go all the way back and then I'd have to try to replicate it. So it's not great in that regard, but it's just something you have to work around. You'll practice with it and you'll get better at it, but it still takes me hours to do my recordings if you're a perfectionist. So the other things that I could cover is, say, something with manual focus. So if you go to focus, and I actually take back the camera, so again, I could go to enable, take back the camera. If I go to focus, manual focus, and let's go back to, let's actually focus on my little alt here. But let's focus on his face. He's actually staring at me now. So let's focus on this creepy guy, this stranger in our world. So we could focus on his face. This is autofocus right now. However, we could go back to manual focus. To enable it, you just press one of the buttons and it'll show up. Right now, it's a pretty big range. You can see this is a really big range. In this case, I don't want that because I don't want the background. If I were to manual focus, pull it in. Now he's in focus, but the background is quite in focus as well. So to do that, I'd have to change the aperture. So aperture is going to be, again, how far your focus is actually going. So if you look at it, if I decrease it, it's a tinier sliver. So 2.0, it seems like a good value. I'm going to go back to focus, manual focus, and now I can pull it a little closer. I actually went too far. And once you see the red on the character, now he's in focus. Now, say I want to change focus to something in the background on the fly, you could use autofocus for that. However, as I've noted before, if you have autofocus and then you switch the background, it does it very quickly. There's like no transition between it. So the focus gets pulled extremely fast. So manual focus is good in the cases that you want to have that a lot smoother. Right now I have him in focus, but if I look down, it's not in focus. However, if I wanted to focus on that tree over there smoothly, what I could do is you could double check by looking at macro. Infinity has a little icon, so I want to go to infinity, and that just has a little scenery icon. So that will pull the focus farther away. And again, aperture will it doesn't increase, but the focus distance will encapsulate more things the farther it is. So if we increase it, now I can focus on this tree, and look how big that focus is. There's a lot to focus on now, as opposed to what it was before, which was just this tiny little sliver of his face. As you can see, again, looking at it, this is where the focus collides with the floor. And if I go all the way out, it's actually taking all the tree. And if I keep going, it's still focusing on the tree, despite it also focusing on the far, far mountains in the background. So that is a good thing to note. That is just a thing with how cameras work. Farther it is, more it'll focus. So again, just to recap, got focus on his face now, and we can pull it with the medium speed. Now, focused on the tree. So that's something you'll want to kind of practice as well. You could focus between subject 1, if you have to transition to something in the background, like, okay, something's right behind me. Like, this is a very good example. Like, something's right behind me, but you don't want to focus on it because you want to focus on his face first, like not knowing. Then you could pull focus manual, and it'll be smooth, as opposed to, again, autofocus, where it's like instant, which is not that good looking. And that's about it. VRCLens is really easy to like master. Once you know what to look for in the multitude of menu buttons and everything, and you know what config options you should be using, it's really easy. There really is only 4 things you really need to focus on. That's just aperture, focus, the drone camera controls, I guess, and then, you know, zoom. Those are the 4 things you need for success with VRCLens, at least in my book. So hopefully this video helped. I hope it pushed you to either try VRCLens or give it another shot, or, you know, I guess master any of the skills at all. In the next videos, I will be covering first-person recording, stream camera recording, and OBS setup. I did this video first because this is a lot more fun than all the other ones. A VRCLens is just, it's a beautiful, beautiful little add-on. So, you know, I'd suggest that you grab it. I mean, I assume you already have it if you're watching this point, but, you know. But anyway, hopefully this helped you out. There will be more recording videos in the future. So keep an eye out for those. Sukadia.dev/hub for the Discord if you want updates or you want to follow all my stuff. And that's about it. I appreciate you.